I was really hesitant to make this video at first, but then I realized that it had to be made because you can't really refute creationist claims without actually refuting the misconceptions regarding evolution itself. And with the CMI, there were many misconceptions that they tried to spread about evolution. And quite frankly, I realize I'm not qualified to talk about evolution any more than they are. These are all facts that I was able to gather through online sources, and I can recognize that some of them might not be necessarily the best or the most credible sources available. And so, with that said, I would like to extend an open invitation of sorts to anyone watching this video with qualifications or with any sort of background, or anyone in general who can see any flaw or any part of the video that could use rewording. I would like you to let me know, and I'll try and fix my mistakes as best as possible. Round 3 with Creation Ministries International. And if teaching the controversy was their core, I guess you could say the flaws in evolution would be its spine or its support. I've already mentioned that there is no controversy regarding evolution, and that most modern biologists today accept evolution as a scientific fact and as a viable theory to explain the diversity of life. I also explained that there are no moral issues connected with believing in evolution, because evolution does not tell us in any way, shape, or form how we should or should not act. Calvin Smith, I address you now directly. I find you a disgusting person. And you probably drew that conclusion with the tone of my previous videos, but I'll say it straight up. I find you reprehensible. Put it this way. My Christian friend, the one that brought me to the seminar, the one that has next to no knowledge on basic concepts that we teach in school today, like face it, he didn't even take the sciences in grade 11 or 12, he could sound 100 times less ignorant than you sounded in that seminar. But in order to stop creationist critics of mine to accuse me of making a baseless ad hominem, let's get to it. Now, the first thing I ought to do is define what evolution means, and granted, I might not do a good job, and there might be better definitions out there. But from what I've gathered, the most basic definition I could provide for evolution is the change of certain traits in a population over a given amount of time. And now keep in mind, when I'm talking about evolution here, I'm talking about evolution from a biological standpoint only. I'm not talking about chemical evolution or cosmic evolution as mentioned in the seminar. Now, how these changes are brought about are through genes, essentially. Genes are rather important in biology as it really does define us as who and what we are. Genes undergo what's called mutation, which is a permanent change in the DNA sequence of a particular gene. Now, our DNA does not necessarily have to go through a mutation in order to provide change within an organism. There are several other ways that DNA can affect us that do not involve insertions, deletions, or recombinations of our DNA. For example, DNA methylation being one of them. What are some examples of evolution? Well, the first ones off my mind are the ones that I learned at school. Darwin's peppered moss being the easiest one. Salamanders being another one of them. Certain species of orchids were also observed by Darwin. And now to address the creationist claims. What evolution is not? Evolution is not, as Calvin Smith so blatantly said, pond scum to human being. That would be a rather distorted version of what we call abiogenesis. Evolution is also not to be confused with cosmogenesis, which is the creation and development of the cosmos. Evolution also never states that a fruit fly can turn into a butterfly. These are two completely separate species. You will never hear an evolutionist or even anyone just versed in basic biology ever claim that a species can give offspring to a different species, or even more absurd, You'll never hear someone say that a species can morph into another species. The changes as described by evolution is something that cannot necessarily be seen immediately, as creationists will so often describe. It is something that is observed over a long and sometimes an extended period of time. Calvin Smith posed a rather interesting question to the audience, and I think it was more targeted at me, since he knew I was an atheist, since I voiced myself previous to his question. And he asked, well, we know that when we give birth to our children, that they are completely different from us, but does that necessarily prove evolution? And he smiled and shook his head in a really condescending way, as if to say, well, what a ridiculous thing. And naturally the audience followed suit, and they all started, chuckling. Ah! Yes! For your information, that does prove evolution, at a very small scale, but it is evolution, no less. It doesn't even have to be visible traits. As long as you have the genetic makeup of one generation and the genetic makeup of another, you can compare the two. And obviously, unless they were cloned, you would see some changes. He goes on to explain to the audience the clear absurdity of evolution, as given by an example that we evolutionists frequently use. And that would be how certain viruses react to antibiotics, and how evolution clearly explains that certain traits, like the resistance to antibiotics, will be passed down through subsequent generations, and therefore antibiotics might be effective if this strain was allowed to procreate. But no, this isn't evolution according to him. Do you know why? Because according to him, this certain antibiotic reacts with an enzyme in the bacteria to kill the bacteria. So any bacteria that does not produce this enzyme therefore has a survival advantage, and clearly he finds that absurd. More is not necessarily better. It all depends on the environment you're in. And in the case of bacteria, sure, more is definitely not necessarily better, as this allowed the bacteria to survive and eventually procreate. Is that so difficult to understand? Probably my favorite fucked up part of the evening when it comes to evolution and basic genetics was when he presented a Punnett square. Now you might be asking, how the hell can he fuck up something as easy as a Punnett square? Oh, he did. For those of you who don't know what a Punnett square is, it's essentially a diagram used by biologists to determine the genotype of the offspring as dictated by the genotype of both parents. The Punnett square he presented that evening looked something like this. It was a diagram comparing the traits of a dog, specifically long hair and short hair. Now, according to him, long hair would be represented by the capital L, and short hair will be represented by the small letter L. Now, doing the dihybrid cross we see in biology, you would supposedly get 25% of your offspring having short hair, 25% of your offspring having long hair, and 50% of your offspring having medium length. What he said was true, but not always, and it's a fairly incomplete explanation at that. See, what he neglected to mention was that in genetics, there are what we call dominant and recessive traits. See, what he described in his Punnett square is what we call codominance of alleles, and to my knowledge, I don't think most alleles are codominant. So, using his example of the dog, and assuming that long hair is dominant and short hair is recessive, it is not necessarily true that 25% of the offspring will be short-haired, 25% will be long-haired, and 50% will be medium-haired. It could also be that 25% are short hair and 75% are long hair. You see why that might be a bit different from what he explained? Now, oddly enough, I presented all of this to my friend late last night, and he said, well, what are your sources of information? Funny how he never asks for Calvin Smith's sources of information, because he gets all of his information from his PhDs that he works with. And I showed him my grade 11 biology textbook. PhD's my ass. Thanks for watching, and may the truth always be heard.